This is Reimagining Higher Education, your go-to podcast with remarkable education leaders, sharing personal stories from their experience in and around the sector, including reflection and hope for progress. With your host, Dr. Noreen Golfman, former Provost and Vice President Academic at Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland, and inaugural member of Studiosity's Academic Advisory Board in Canada. We collectively recognize that this podcast's hosts and guests have recorded this interview from across Turtle Island on the unceded and traditional territories of many nations in what we now know as Canada. We acknowledge past and current custodians of this land.
Welcome to Reimagining Higher Education. I'm your host, Noreen Golfman. I am a recovering academic, retired provost, and now professor emeritus from Memorial University, St. John's, Newfoundland. And with me today is Ann Buller. She is president emeritus of Centennial College. So welcome, Ann.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, we normally start these podcasts, and I did one myself and was asked the same question, to bring an object to this conversation as a way of opening us up into maybe earlier experience you've had that helped shape who you are today. Bring an object that helps us understand you as an educator, something that you might have kept close to yourself all those years as president. So I'm curious to see what you brought or what you're going to mention.
So it's such an interesting challenge to try to find sort of one thing that defines you. But many, many years ago, I had a friend who gave me a small antique compass. And for years, I actually wore it around my neck. It was 3 or 4 inches around, and it had that patina of being something old. And she gave it to me because at the time I was leading student success work, and she kind of talked to me about how she saw my role as helping people find their direction. But I think the reason it stayed with me, and that symbolism of a compass has stayed with me for so long, is just because it's one of those things that says you're never really lost. There's always a way through something, even when it's very difficult. It represented, I like vintage things and things with age and story, and that's stayed with me. And it's part of how I was an educator, was to share stories and encourage other people to share their stories. I think it just is a reminder of different times, of simpler times. This was the only way you could find a way forward, was to find north. And I think that for human beings, finding our own kind of true north. So it just became a symbol for me of things I love, vintage, antique, things with stories. And this notion that while you may hold the compass, it doesn't mean you're the only one finding the direction, right? And so there's a lot into it. There's layers and layers of meaning to this vintage compass. And since then, many others that I've acquired over time. So that's probably one of my favorite objects.
Yeah, that's a great concept all around, and far better than a bag of breadcrumbs, I should think.
Hopefully it lasts longer and you're not being followed by something that's going to eat you. But
exactly. What was university like for you as an undergraduate and then a postgraduate?
So it's a great question, because I think my story is one that's often a little bit overlooked when we talk about higher education in this country. I started at a college, at Humber College here in Toronto. I did a 3-year public relations communications program. And so that was my only full-time experience in post-secondary education, was at Humber. And I worked 1 or 2 jobs all the way through. I actually loved it, because although I had the grades to get into university, I never saw myself there because of my history and background. University, in my parents' mind, and certainly in mine, was where people who are wealthy and privileged went. I just knew I couldn't afford it. And so it never even occurred to me to look into student loans. I just thought, I can't afford it, so I can't afford college if I work hard enough. But it was an amazing experience, partially because of that. It sounds so cliched to say the hands-on experience, but it really was, and I really thrived there. I then did both my baccalaureate and my master's degree the long, hard way, which was part-time. So I never lived in a residence. I never had that go away to school experience. Everything was living at home and working at least one job all the way through, and then working full-time as I did the degree completion part-time. So amazing experiences, but not how we typically see a college or university experience profiled in Canada.
I suppose, but it must be very, very common. I mean, were your friends, your peer groups following the same kind of path through college and part-time work?
So interesting. I would say that most of my class, absolutely. Full-time students, part-time work. There were, again, socioeconomic background between first-year student at college and university, quite different, especially then. And so many of us had to work our way through. And then what was interesting, it's so much better now in terms of transfer credit. But then after a 3-year advanced diploma, when I went to university, I was given 3 credits.
Wow.
So now there's much more rich and fulsome and respectful, I would argue, agreements between the two sectors. But then, particularly in Ontario, it was a little bit different. So I loved each of the learning experiences I had, but they were vastly different.
In what way was the university different?
So it was funny because I have a friend who went to Smith College in the US, and I don't know that there's a more polar opposite
Right.
to going to a local college, right? And we would often have this debate because she worked out of college with me. We'd had this debate about the two systems. And I have to say, partially because of always being such an advocate and champion for colleges, and sometimes being on the defensive because of how we were referred to in the popular vernacular, I wasn't sure how much university would change me. I thought that I'd be going to learn stuff, but because at college I'd learned stuff and I learned how to do things, I had a bias towards that. But university was actually quite extraordinary for me because I delved into areas that that I didn't think I would ever study, just because of some of the things you have to do, like logic and reasoning, and some of the English literature courses that I took that just were so rich. I mean, I majored in sociology, as many of us do when we don't really know what we want to be when we grow up. But it was a remarkable experience. I loved the debate. I loved the engagement. Again, because I went part-time, so many of my classmates were teachers who were upskilling, or, we were such a diverse group,
Mhm.
age-wise. We had a few full-time students who were picking up a course they'd missed at night. But I mean, I loved all that dynamic. And I found that a lot of the professors who taught at night, I mean, there were some exceptions to this, but I found they really cared about the fact that we wanted an education. I remember one professor saying, if you want a letter of reference for me to get into graduate school, please know that I'm not going to base it solely on your grades. I know why you're here. I know what you're giving up. I know what the challenges are. So don't be afraid to ask me if your average is a B and not an A. Let's talk about that. And I thought that was so respectful. And I didn't expect that at a university just because I didn't know what to expect,
Yeah, that's a great story and underscores the influence that people have almost accidentally on your career path and dreams and expectations, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah. I wonder whether you recognized at the time that you had leadership qualities and were destined for something great.
Well, I think that I knew I wanted to make a difference, and people pointed out to me that leadership is often the way to do that. I mean, even in college, when we studied fundraising, it was our class's responsibility to run the United Way campaign for the college. And
Oh,
when part of what we had to do in our events class was run the blood donor clinic. So, we had things that gave you leadership opportunities and also were results driven. You either met the targets or you didn't. And so, really real life experience. So I think partially being an immigrant and that early day in a Canadian education system where you're being teased for your accent. And then I think having this, I think I got from my parents, this fighting for the underdog. I think all of those things kind of led me to want to lead. I had no concept, especially in those early years, that it ever would lead to a presidency. And in fact, it was one of my mentors who pushed me to apply when he said, tell me what changes you want to make in a college. And I told him, and he said, and what job might let you do that? And so I was hoisted on my own petard and ended up being that. So I knew I wanted to lead. I wasn't sure what that looked like, and who knew how far I would go.
What were some of those changes you were thinking about?
In terms of changes to the system?
Yeah.
Well,
that's
so
probably a long answer.
So I have always believed that education, that we have to provide good, solid access to as many people as possible for education, and that excellence is the output measure. You know, we don't have to be, we can stop being so proud of who we let in, and we start being really proud of who graduates. So this notion of access, and that wasn't just about, you know, high school grades. I'm not just talking about that, but people like me, the first in their family to go to higher education, people who were new Canadians, people who had been marginalized because of Indigenous status, because of ability, all of that. Like, that had been a big driver of who I was. And so one of the things I wanted to really change in post-secondary was our view of that. Of looking at those groups as people with deficits, instead of saying these are people with great strengths that maybe we're not measuring properly when we let them in. The second was a real notion that I have that leaders aren't born, they're made. So yes, if you're born into the royal family, you may be a princess, king, queen one day. But generally speaking, we all have the capacity to learn leadership skills. And that doesn't mean we're all going to be, you know, the person at the front of the room, the person on the stage, the person leading the organization. It means we're going to learn valuable lessons. That's us lead in our community, lead our families, you know, be stronger. And so how do we get more chances for leadership capacity development in higher ed? And it connects to a notion of civic responsibility and service to community. More of that integration. You know, we talk a lot about town and gown relationships, but they can be so tenuous and they can be shallow. And I think that there's more that could be done. So they were some of the things that really drove me. And fundamentally, I think leadership should be a contact sport. You know, I think it should move you, touch you. I think you should come out of it with a few bruises and sweating a little, but changed. And too often I heard about lecture theaters with 300 people in it, all doing the same thing on the same schedule, the same way. And it just, to me, that broke my heart. And thankfully, it wasn't my university experience, because when you went at night, they were much smaller classes. But I felt there was so much more we could do.
And what barriers did you face along the way of trying to make those changes? Or opportunities, I should turn it both ways.
So I think probably one of the biggest barriers is you're messing with, as Peter Drucker used to say, you know, the traditional hierarchy architecture of higher education. And I think whenever you try to do that, you get the buts. Oh, but we can't lower our standards. Oh, but we can't, because we never have. And I think part of the challenge was to work with the faculty, the leadership teams, the board of governors to say, just because we never have doesn't mean we shouldn't. And so the barrier was to say, so for example, one of the things we did at Centennial was bring in a distinction in leadership that was a separate credential students could earn. And part of it was in class. Most of it was you need to go out and do things. You need to capture your learning. So it wasn't a tick box of things that people would do. It was actual, fundamental, honest, true engagement. And we opened it up to every student. We did not charge for this because, again, we try to not make money a barrier anytime we could. So bringing this in to say leadership matters, it should be credentialed. we should pay for it. All of those things are a bit different than the usual financial models of higher ed. So that was one of the barriers. And then I think getting people, and this wasn't a challenge per se, it was a real opportunity, was to get our whole community seized on this notion that we could do more. The interesting thing about the distinction in leadership, we actually had people complete it in the first year we offered it, which stunned me. I assumed it would take at least 2 years, and in some cases more than that. But perhaps one of the most defining moments for me was when our faculty came and said, and our support staff, they came and said, we love what you're doing for students, can we do it? So by the time I left Centennial, we were on our 6th cohort of our faculty and staff engaging and earning a distinction in leadership. So, those barriers of no, but I think it's creating the case for change and engaging people and getting them excited about the possibilities of those changes.
Yeah, this is kind of a hard question for me to even think about, because I'm never sure exactly. I'm partly sure of the answer for myself, but do you think much has changed in terms of that hierarchical architecture in the system in post-secondary college or university? I know you've helped to make changes, and I think women leaders in particular struggle to open up the space to flatten some of that hierarchy, because we have experienced the ill effects of the opposite too often. But have you seen much change? And I say much change because maybe we've seen a little change. I wonder what your thoughts are.
So I would answer it 2 ways. I think we've seen some real change in, for example, the diversification of credentials, everything from micro to postgraduate. And I think that diversification has caused the public to engage with us differently. It's caused employers to engage with the sector differently. And I think it's really helped people who are trying to actually get on that first step on the rung of higher ed, or it's helped those who have a fantastic degree but need targeted job skills, right? So I think that's changed. I think things like applied research, predominantly at colleges, but we're seeing it more along with the true pure applied research at universities. I think that's changed. When you talk about the structure and the leadership and some of those fundamental things that people hang on to, I think that's been much slower. And I think the thing that breaks my heart a little bit is when leadership changes, when you start to see some of those changes get pulled back. We resort to the comfortable. And I think that is a shame. I've seen things change in terms of the relationships between colleges and universities. As an example, better partnerships, stronger benefit for taxpayers because students aren't having to repeat, research projects and centers having more partners at the table. I think all of that's changed. But I think sustainable change in the view of education in a way that will fundamentally upend some of those, the anchors people are held by, I don't know that I'm going to see that in my lifetime. Pockets of it, yes. A movement, even though it's glacial, yes. But, when you've seen people come out with really radical things, it's been a difficult fight, and it's always about the sustainability of it over time.
Absolutely. I wonder what the experience is like today for students entering college or university, how different it would have been, or it is, from our experience, where you said you had a notion of the university being very elitist. And I think that still dominates. I mean, there is an anti higher education kind of current in our culture. And I say our, broadly speaking, I think that's true, capturing some of the resistance to elitist ideas or whatever that might be because of the nature of inequity and the slow pace of seeing a much more inclusive and accessible world. So there's obviously there's a hard resistance to accepting the possibility of higher education as a place for real change. And I get that, but I wonder how much students are aware of that today. Do you have a sense of that from younger people?
Well, it's interesting. I think, again, it would vary greatly across discipline. And I think, and the diversity of the institution and so many factors. I think one thing students, whether they're aware of it or not, but we didn't talk about mental health. When I was a student, part-time, full-time, whatever, no one reached out and said, we have a wellness program, we have a mental, none of that was there. And I think these younger generations that are coming up, they're much braver than we, I would say, are to say, I suffer from this, I struggle with this, because they don't see it in a weakness. They see it as part of who they are and it needs to be addressed. That was not my experience. We certainly had counselors, but it was nothing like the same thing as now.
Sure.
And I think students today in sort of all levels, like in high school as well, when we look at our view of what technology would do, when I first heard about emerging technologies when I was studying in college and university, it was the desktop. I'm dating myself to say I was so excited the first time I saw a fax machine. What is this magic? But we could make mistakes and they died. If you did something stupid in high school, you suffered for it a bit, but really, then you got on with your life. And I think for everything that technology and social media can do that is positive, I think we're seeing the toll it has taken on the mental health of so many. And I think it's actually in a strange way taken us back to those essential employability skills. People have lost the ability to think critically because they chased this demon of social media, this connectivity. So that framing, that whole kind of technological impact, I think, has so changed what the first year experience looks like. Do the students know it? Maybe, but the students going in now have never lived without technology at their fingertips. I also think there's been a little bit of move away from the lecture and into more engaging kind of work, particularly in smaller universities, and even colleges are getting much better at this work integrated learning piece. But I don't know, students expect it. That's the good thing. But I don't know if they knew, it didn't used to be there.
It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? Because the social part of social media actually has generated a kind of a sense of the individual as a very isolated cell in a digital network. And all the research shows, certainly recent research, that students still prefer in-person learning. Even that 300-person class gives them a kind of physical experience that they're denied from this kind of experience. And it is, I think, a growing paradox because there is, as you say, the need for connectivity, but it's got to be located or offset that digital connectivity by something real and in person and human, breathing the same space. And pandemic, of course, has aggravated so much of the complexity or the anxiety around connectivity, for sure.
I do think, when you relate that to the changes we've seen in institutions, I mean, I gave a talk a little while back about the impact of COVID in terms of, the question was post-secondary education in Canada successful in their COVID kind of mitigation strategies and in their getting students back up to the learning environment, all of these kind of things, to the learning outcomes rather. And I mean, my answer to that would be, I think we did brilliant things in the moment, right? I think that at my own former college, we had a very slow pace of getting courses, never mind full programs online, and all of a sudden, boom, right? But the winners will be the ones who say, what did we learn? What went well? What didn't? And what does this mean for learning going forward? Are we going back to everybody on campus? My personal belief is that hybrid is really meets accessibility goals, but also allows for that in-person dynamic, that sense of community and spontaneity, right? That kind of things
Right.
that happen when you
Right.
bump into each other in the classroom with ideas, that's often much more difficult online. So, there's COVID has been a defining moment, and if we lose the learning from it, then frankly, shame on us. But I think what we've also seen is the story of loneliness and isolation. And I fear that some students have lost something in that capacity to engage. They now want to work from home
Right.
because of the lifestyle piece. But if you're a single person who did all your university or college alone, and now you're going to do your work alone, I worry about, going back to my earlier points about civic engagement, about service. We're losing some of that. At every convocation I ever spoke at, I would say to people, put down your phone, just 5 minutes, just be in the moment, right? And we're losing that, and I worry about it.
Yeah, it's definitely worrisome, and I don't know how I mean, it's a runaway train, or it's a rocket. There's, as with AI and so much that technology is bringing us, you can't fight it. We have to learn to exploit the best use of it. And I guess that's a conversation, as you say, certainly following, several years of isolation and the pandemic, we're all asking ourselves, we're kind of in this living laboratory, aren't we? Following all of that at every level, really. What would you like to see changed for students today, if anything, if we could wave a magic wand or offer a way forward to help and support them?
I would have a mandatory, and I know your other question about making changes, every time you say something's mandatory, then you have to duck because a lot of things are going to be thrown your way.
Yeah.
But I would have a mandatory course, whatever you want to call it, but not a one-off thing that's about wellness and mindfulness and about, taking care of yourself, getting to know who you are, understanding your strengths. And you could make them discipline specific, but I don't think you need to. And part of the reason I feel so strongly about that is we introduced a mindful medics program for our first year paramedic students because, you start learning to be a paramedic and then you're out on the rides and you see some really traumatic things. It's a tough enough program, and then you're suddenly dealing with that. And it was just a thing we started doing once a week, led by a phenomenal faculty, totally voluntary, and it was packed. So many students came. We ended up creating a general education credit that students from all different disciplines could attend that was really around this notion. And the feedback from students was extraordinary. And so I think that, again, with other people, getting to know yourself, doing that exploration. So much of that is a fundamental tenet of education that gets knocked out because we have to do so much in so many years, with so many hours and all of those kinds of things. That would be one of them. I think more opportunities for students to lead and actually crediting that, acknowledging that. At colleges, we got better at doing prior learning assessment and saying, okay, you worked 3 years as a bookkeeper, you're coming into accounting, you probably don't have to do these 3 courses. Let's find out. We need to be able to do that with leadership as well. And when I was in Nova Scotia, we did a lot in terms of helping people create portfolios that captured your leadership narrative. And we did a bit of that at Centennial. I kind of brought that with me when I went. It's an odd thing to say more flexibility, because flexibility usually means distance, online, all those kinds of things. But I think flexibility in choosing learning outcomes, flexibility in, how you demonstrate those. Every student shouldn't have to write a 20-page essay. there should be other amazing creative ways that we can find out, have they learned it? Have they grasped it? Do they recognize their own learning? And so, to me, I've been to many a really good lecture, but it mattered when I got to follow it up with some kind of experience that changed my mind. The hardest thing to do for anybody, change their mind, help them see that world in a different way. And so it goes back to my contact sport. I mean, I would say, you should have some bruises and dents and a really different sense of self when you come out of education, regardless of the type of it.
Oh, I fully agree. Although I'm straining to think of how you would teach or talk about being present and mindful to young people, especially in a social media informed age, because it's something one comes to, right? Some learns. And how do you mandate a lecture around that? I'm kind of curious about how you get people to pay. I can get it with the medics. I can really see a path there for talking about mindfulness and being aware of oneself through very stressful situations. But what about for a science student or an art student or a general student? What kind of approach would you take to in a course like that or a lecture like that?
So it's so interesting. I'll give you an example. So Centennial College has always been extremely diverse, partially because we're located in Scarborough, which was at the time the most diverse of all of the GTA, right? Just an immigrant settlement community. And I always thought that as a strength, but then I grew up in highly diverse communities.
Right.
But I recognize, even in Canada, not everybody saw this diversity as a strength. So when we were looking at, what was our signature learning experience going to be? How are we going to blow up the educational model to do something different? And we started to look at, what are the essential employability skills? And we did some work with employers around that. And, employers in all kinds of different language talked about the ability for people from different backgrounds to be able to work together and to understand. They talked about an emotional maturity that they weren't seeing from graduates. And this wasn't just a Centennial graduate. This was just, in fact, in many cases, our employers were talking about anybody they hired. So they were identifying new types of essential employability skills that, in my mind, were more about the human aspect of us, right? Less about the technical knowledge. And so we turned our signature learning experience into a focus on global citizenship and social justice. And to your point, we had some of the faculty in our engineering schools and our transportation schools saying, what? I'm sorry, what are you doing?
I bet.
And we brought it in a number of ways. One was we did have a mandatory course called Global Citizenship, from social analysis to social action. And with a few bruises, we got that through. So that was mandated. Every single student would take it. And yes, we had some mini revolts. Absolutely. We had people say, you're taking us off the tools to learn this. One of the things we found powerful in talking about that was actually bringing some of the employers in. So the mini revolt I had in the School of Transportation, we brought in all of our major training partners, and they said to the students, we understand you don't want to learn about the world. You don't want to learn about inequality. You don't want to learn about yourself and your role in the world. We understand that. And this class is going, yeah, that's right, we don't. And they said, well, just know, then we don't want to hire you. Because we're looking for employees who can resolve conflicts, have discussions, who can work at senior levels with countries from all over the world. If you don't want that, then please know you probably won't work for us. And we had GM, Honda, we had Lexus, we had significant employers there. And it was eye-opening for the faculty, who kind of fomented the little mini revolt, and also for the students in that class. And more, as people in our pilot session, 4 of the students who took the course in the pilot then spoke at a professional development day for our student leaders and for our faculty and staff. And they talked about what the course had meant to them to their career goals, to their personal understanding. And that's when we started to see the faculty go, well, I want my students to feel that way. Like it was a bit of a surge. Then to your point about how do you, everybody can take a course. I took biology. I remember nothing. How do you get it to stick? So we created our global citizenship service learning experiences. And these were anywhere from, I think the shortest we did was 8 days. They were generally, 14. We had one as long as 18 days. They were co-created by anyone on the college campus and an in-country NGO, an NGO that could be validated, and that we had checks and balances. And we started to send groups of students all over the world, not with a hi, I'm from Canada, I have the answers, but as learning experiences. But while they were there, they got their hands dirty. We did everything from some biodiversity in the Amazon. We have done counting turtles hatching in Costa Rica. We have built, or helped build rather, a shelter for abused women and children in India. We've worked in orphanages in China and in Peru. We've built greenhouses for schools in Peru. And we started a medical clinic in Roatan that until the pandemic, we'd been for, I think, 12 years in a row, focusing on maternal health, infection control, and diabetes control. So first of all of those things, many people don't think college students can or would be doing. But the research, the outcome, these students came back saying, I'm going to volunteer. I want to start my own not-for-profit. I want to do more. And it was phenomenal. And then they became, the disciples for this kind of work. Now, again, we paid for these. Money was not going to be the reason that the students couldn't have these experiences. And when they got back to Canada, or we also did In Reserve and Habitat for Humanity builds in Canada, when they got back, they had to do a local in-service that could be teaching others about what they learned, or could be totally unrelated, but would make a difference in their local community. So from that start of hearing what's needed in this world, how do you get it to drill down? It happened relatively quickly, but that's the work. That's the work of transformation. That's the work of changing minds. And sometimes it's one-on-one with particular folks who are just, I don't see this. I remember one nursing faculty saying to me, Ann, we're graduating nurses. We're not trying to change the world. I'm saying, well, you can do both. Not to mention, let's talk about patient-centered care. Let's talk about this thing happening in your field, and how if your students had better understandings of things we're talking about, why wouldn't they be better at their job?
Well, that's a great answer. Great story. Very inspiring. I love the idea of taking students from social analysis to social action. I would vote for that as a required course, a required program, actually. I wish we were doing a lot more of that. I mean, when we think about reimagining higher ed, that would be a big focus, I think, or should be. But we're not quite yet there, but certainly your example is quite inspiring, I think, Anne. What advice would you give to the younger Anne? I know it's a stumper. If you knew then what you know now.
I think I would tell myself not to be so hard on myself. I was the student who, when I got an essay back in class, would go out and sit in my car and had to talk to myself for 10 minutes before I would look at the grade. And, I would tell me that those grades didn't matter as much as I thought they did, that the learning matters more than the grade. And I would tell myself to be a bit more gentler with myself. I think I would also say, the struggles are worth it for the most part. I don't mean terrific, horrific, excuse me. I don't mean horrific things that happen in your life, but the slog days, I would tell myself that you get through it. There's another side. And I used to have a sign that hung in my office that said, live out of your imagination, not your history. And I think I would tell myself more of that. I mean, my parents often felt awful that they never ever considered that their children would go to university, but that was totally because of where they came from, and never about whether they thought we could actually do it. right? And so I think some of that, they were small bags, but it was baggage that I carried. I think I would tell myself to let it go a lot earlier. And I think, when I say this to leaders I work with now, in fact, to students, there's just a gift when one day you feel comfortable in your own skin. I gave a speech recently where I started by saying I am bad at many things. And I went through a number of things that I'm really bad at. I am never going to be good at them, but I like them. They bring me joy. And we've got to remember to not be afraid to be bad at things, to try them anyway, to stop searching for mastery in everything. Just go do it and enjoy it. And not to be afraid to be last. Like, be last. Who cares? Did you have fun? Did you learn something from it? I mean, yeah, I think there's a gentleness that I would have suggested to my younger self that took me a long time. I'm still not there, but I'm much more there than I ever thought possible when I was younger.
That's probably true for many of us, I would say. I have one more question, unless there's more you want to talk about, I'm happy to do. Related to that, what advice would you give to senior leaders today in the sector?
Oh,
Or aspiring senior leaders, both.
Well, for senior leaders, I would say stop using the word transformation when what you mean is you're going to tinker at the edges and feel good about it. It's such a frustration. I cannot tell you. That's a whole podcast in itself about
sure.
the shameful things we call transformation when really they're not. And I would encourage more and more to not bring back the autocratic leadership. I've seen in a few places across this country recently where there's this sense of, the president as champion, as hero, as knower of all things. And I think it's so regressive. We succeeded because we built teams and we built leadership capacity throughout. That's what you should be trying to do. If you're the VP academic, don't try to get your deans just to stay in their lane. Help them to do what their job is well, but to keep pushing, right? Have them want to be in your role, or at least understand your role so that they're champions of it. They're probably my biggest things for senior leaders. Make the radical change. Do it as part of a team. And you'll get farther faster. For those who are coming up, again, I believe you can innovate from the side of your desk. So there's a strategic plan and a business plan. There's all these things the institution has to do. And yes, you have a job and you can't take your eye off that. That's why you're there. But sometimes if you have a spark, if you have a challenge, don't be afraid to look at it and say, I think I have a solution. Let me put this together. Let me try this. Use a pilot project. I look at some of the student success work I did early in my career. And, we had to defund another project in order to invest in that. And it radically transformed our first year student experience. Those ideas you have, you can run with them. You can try them in small ways before you go ask for the big money. I also would encourage them to have mentors, but to choose them wisely. The most popular senior leaders doesn't mean they're the best. Someone who you don't know very well, but you kind of admire some of the things that they do, reach out to some of them. Don't expect everybody to say yes. But I think sometimes we look at mentorship as just getting something from someone who's been there before. And I think it can be so much more. I think it can be much more reciprocal than it has been historically. And so I'd say, just like I say, choose your heroes wisely and emulate the best of them. I would say the same thing about your mentors. And I would say to both those groups, if you don't like your work, if it doesn't fill you up, if it doesn't bring you joy, I'm not talking every day, because if you feel like that every day, you're on some kind of drug.
Something's definitely wrong with you.
Right? Something is wrong. But if generally speaking, you don't have that, you're in the wrong place. You're in the wrong place. And so you need to make some decisions, because students deserve us to be at places we love, with missions we value, fighting the good fight and doing the good work. And if at some point that changes for you, and it's not, I'm not talking about if you're having, personal wellness issues, that's different. I'd encourage you to go get help. But if it's suddenly the mission and vision just aren't yours anymore, you need to do the courageous and right thing, and that is to leave, and find somewhere that brings you back. Because students don't deserve you to be miserable in your job. They'll feel it one way or another eventually, and we owe them more than that.
No kidding. Well, that's great advice. And I wish I had absorbed some of that myself in earlier times, but one learns what kind of advice one wants to give along the way, of course, through, as you say, highs and lows, failures and otherwise. But you've given us a lot to think about, and I hope there will be students listening to this, because you've given some really terrific advice, Ann. Anything else you want to add that you think you should have added to a question or a comment?
I think I would just say thank you to you and to Studiosity for putting this out there. We need more spaces for frank and enjoyable conversations. So I've really appreciated this morning with you. Thank you.
Same here. Thank you so much.
Visit studiosity.com/Students First for information on the next Students First Symposium, an open forum for faculty, staff, and academics to candidly discuss and progress the issues that matter most in higher education.